Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. So glad you could join me on this evening. I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing introduction. Please check out Ken Quiethawk. Nothing like looking at one thing and saying another. Please check out Ken Quiethawk on the internet. He has an amazing website. He and his wife are native storytellers, and they preserve history in probably one of the oldest ways that can be preserved, and that's with a verbal storytelling aspect to their historical and cosmological belief systems. And it's an amazing, wonderful way of sharing history. And I think, we probably would be better off if we were doing it that way today, but, that's just my opinion. So tonight's show is kind of unique for me. About a decade ago, that's 10 years, my husband and I presented a video called Secrets of the Stones at a Megalithomania conference in Connecticut. And at that time, I met a gentleman, and he gave me his card, and I tucked it away so I wouldn't lose it. And as with most things, when you want to save them and make sure you don't lose them, you lose them immediately, but you lose them in a safe place so that a decade later you will rediscover the card and put a call in. And that's what I did with Robert. Robert Longley is the creator of the Atlantis Project website, and that's the AtlantisProject.org website. He's been searching for Atlantis for more than 40 years. He's been mapping sites mathematically and through satellite imagery, as well as visiting many ancient sites throughout the world. And he's been looking for evidence of Atlantis as a global culture and not just a single location. He's a former intelligence officer, which means he knows how to look, and is an IT consultant. He's created an amazing website that, for me, is very exciting because, among other things, he's pointing out a lot of sites that I did not have any knowledge of were possible Atlantises, and he makes a very good case for they all have something to do with Atlantis. So welcome to the show, Robert. I'm glad you're here to enlighten all of us.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's, usually everybody, not everybody, most people know the Plato story and how Atlantis, came through history and Plato told about it, and that everybody has been searching for it ever since then. But when he heard about it, it was thousands of years old. So, most things don't stand the test of time and last a decade, but Atlantis is something special, and I think, among other things, it's a concept that all of us want to believe is possible. And
sure,
we want,
it's
we
kind
want
of
to
a
believe.
romantic notion.
Absolutely. But as far as where was it and what happened to it, there really isn't. I mean, outside the Pillars of Hercules, there's a lot of land or water outside the Pillars of Hercules. So,
sure.
It's kind of like everybody. I mean, you have on your website so many different places that it could have been. I mean, you've got Spain and Bimini, and then there's El Dorado and Hyperborea and the Berbers, and I mean, you've listed a whole bunch of different places, and you make a very good case for every one of them.
Sure.
So
that's one of the challenges. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, originally when I put up the website, I was hoping that I could get people with different views to kind of come together, but there's a lot of very distinct camps about where people think it is. Some people think it's in Bimini. Some people think it's in Spain. Some people think it's in the Mediterranean, and everybody's got a good argument for where they think it is. One of the best documented is actually work of Jim Allen, and he has found a site in Bolivia, which he says matches the dimensions for Plato. But Plato, is kind of fraught with problems because there's debates over the measurements in the book and whether they were off by a factor of 10. There's also two different pillars of Hercules, ones that we're familiar with at Gibraltar, and there's also another one that is part of Greece. So a lot of debate over what was Plato actually talking about. And then there's the people who think that he just made the whole thing up to teach a lesson about morality based on the politics of the time and the corruption that he saw in Athens during that time. So you've got a lot of divided camps. And, growing up, I started reading the books by like Charles Berlitz and some of the others around that time, and Ignatius Donnelly and some of the others. And they were fun to read and told a great story, but in many cases it was hard to document what was actually in there. Even Chariots of the Gods, a lot of what von Daniken listed, he did it from pictures and may not have meant to mislead, but some of the things that he claimed or wrote about really didn't bear up under if you started looking under the microscope. So that was kind of me taking a step back from it, as a teenager and wanting to try and piece the pieces together on my own. And I actually started reaching out to different people at that time, just to find out what they knew and, try to get some more details. Are you familiar with Maria Reich? She was the German archaeologist who documented the Nazca lines. And as a teenager, I actually corresponded with her through her sister. She was blind at the time. But I reached out to quite a few different people over the years, and just to find out, because a lot of times you would see a picture in a book and it's like, where is that? And these were the days before, Google Maps, and you couldn't go looking for, a picture of, say, a fish-shaped mound in the middle of the Bahamas, because it may not have been documented, and it was done with infrared film. So those sources were a little hard to come by. But in starting to map these things out, I started to notice patterns. And you've seen lots of these grid shaped patterns and maps, various years of energy lines and things like that. But I started noticing different types of patterns. And, the more I looked, the more obvious they were. But back in those days, I was dealing with the largest map I could come up with was about 5 by 3, and I had it on my wall. But once you start taking a round surface and making it flat, you distort things. And the more sites I put up and the more alignments I came up with, I realized that some of them were not as accurate as I wanted them to be. And at one point I reached out to the National Geographic Society, and they had a database that had been put together in late 70s or early 80s based on a survey that the Rockefellers did in Central America in the 1930s. And I was able to get a copy of that, but even playing with that, and as things like Google Earth came on, I found that they weren't even close on some of the sites that they originally mapped. So I've stepped back even further, and once Google Earth came into being, I started mapping things more, and I have some custom programs that I created to look for different patterns. And the basics are that what I'm finding is that you have different levels of patterns within sites, and a lot of these have been documented already. A lot of, you've got the Giza complex, which seems to follow Orion or Cygnus. You have sites like Tenochtitlan, that is organized like the solar system, and you some of the Mayan sites in Central America are mapped out like the Pleiades. So things like that in context, you start to see mathematical information around the structures themselves, stars and constellation information around sites. And then in between the sites is what I started to look at, and finding that the sites seem to be organized around some form of communication. And once you start seeing some of the patterns, it's actually a logical structure in a perfect world of how you would lay out a cellular communications network. It's basically it's circular, and you would have sites connected. I think they're about 68 miles apart. Figuring out the measurement between the sites becomes a little challenging. And what I found in trying to measure things more and more is that we don't know what the reference points are. So I'll let you talk for a little bit.
Oh, no, I'm, as you're talking, I'm thinking the thing that has always bothered me is that obviously the technology that created a lot of these different sites was not in direct proportion to the ability of the people that we think, inhabited them. And so my thing has always been, where did the consciousness come from that enabled them to do this? Who stretched them? And
sure.
So it's and we spoke briefly right before we came on, and at least in Orkney there was a place that was created as a school where tribes would send their smartest and brightest to be educated by the wise people who were there. And and I kind of am wondering if maybe that's what has happened. And as I said before, that I really believe that a lot of this technology and a lot of this insight and a lot of this understanding comes from before the last mass destruction, certainly before the Younger Dryas days. And
yes.
And then you have to go back. Then you have to go back, depending on what map you're looking at, 11,000, 14,000 years is kind of when the last ice age ended, and so that what's going on here is, everybody kind of glides over and says one thing and then moves on when they don't have an answer, and that bothers me greatly, because there is a level of consciousness that some people had that other people didn't have, and they became teachers and wise people, or helped to teach people to question things a little more deeply. And to me, Atlantis is a symbol of something, but maybe Atlantis didn't even exist. Maybe it was a sense of a level of consciousness that people had, and they were the ones that came from, not the stars, because I'm not sure I believe in that. I'll believe in a little gray when one comes up and trick or treats on my door, but
sure.
But it seems to me that we're missing something, and with a lot of our antiquity, we've made up stories that satisfy us, but they come from our frame of reference. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're for. The Great Pyramid at Giza wasn't a burial chamber. Cheops didn't build it, and the Sphinx. Same thing. I mean, there are so many things here that we take for granted that we should be asking questions about. And I don't know how we answer them, but Atlantis is a concept, and you certainly have found evidence for it all over. That Spain was one of my favorite places. I mean, Spain makes great sense. But
sure.
How do you explain that it sank? Because Spain's still there.
Well, I think you have to kind of look at what we know about the planet's history, and that's where I've tried to actually look into specifics to find real clues that other people could go find on Google or Google Maps, or actually go visit themselves. And I think the destruction of Atlantis really ties back to the Younger Dryas event, which you referred to, which I'm not sure the exact date, but it's roughly 13,000 years ago. And based on the evidence, that a lot of evidence has been found just in the last year to support this. So in a nutshell, what I believe happened was we were hit with a large asteroid strike. The first ones hit in Greenland, and they found evidence of that. And they continued across the planet, hitting northern Europe, and there's evidence in Scotland and other places of forts being simply melted, and that's not a technology that was available to the average citizens or residents at that time, but getting hit with an asteroid would definitely do that. The same has been true all the way. A recent site in Syria has been found to be largely melted and show evidence of asteroids. And even in Egypt, the most prized iron came from meteorites. So as well that was happening, the other thing that is a good telltale sign is the Sahara Desert is strewn with glass that's basically been melted. It's a phenomenon that is common in nuclear blasts, but it's easy to find chunks of this glass throughout the Sahara. So I think you had just a whole bunch of meteors striking the Earth, and many landed in the Atlantic and just vaporized huge quantities of water at the time. We know geologically that the Atlantic was between 150 and 400 feet lower than it is in the present. So if you look at just history of man, at any given time in known history, 80% of the world's population lives within 500 feet of sea level. So I think when the initial strike took place, you saw a drop in sea level of probably about 150 feet, and it continued because of the amount of debris that was put into the atmosphere. You saw a period of warming, which eventually the lower sea level continued to rise to its current. So I think you basically lost the people who had beachfront property in the first wave, and they moved inland, or as to the extent that they could escape. I think it was a total catastrophe for most people. And you see sites like the Reich structure in Mauritania, which a lot of people think it's referred to as the Eye of the Sahara.
Talk about that for a second, because you have a picture of it on your website, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I wish it could be excavated more. Mauritania is on the no-go list for the State Department. Not to mention, it is just extremely dangerous area, both from the likelihood of you being killed by the locals, or just the environmental factors. It's extremely hot, and poisonous insects and things like that. So it's not recommended that you go there. There's a couple of people who have done it, and they've posted videos on YouTube. But the area is so it's really just kind of a garbage field. That area of the Sahara is on a trade route, so there's a couple thousand years of trash that has basically been deposited there over the years. So it's really hard to tell what might be real ruins or just artifacts, and what has just been discarded by people traveling through the area. I don't think nobody at this point has done any excavation there to say one way or another that it is in fact Atlantis. But if the sea level had been lower, that would have been a logical place for a port city that led out into the Atlantic. So it's definitely a possibility. I've approached the Atlantis subject as not just a single place, but a common construction technique for cities, because I think there were probably at least 12 city-states, which actually goes back to the tradition of Plato's original story about there were 12 groups of twins, supposedly. And in the area north of Mauritania, twins are actually fairly common from a genetic perspective. So you've got that connection. In around the Atlas Mountains, again, the ATL, which is prominent around the Atlantic area and ties back again to Atlantis and Atlas. So there's a lot of connections possibly there. If you look for circular cities, they're everywhere. Carthage, if the Reich structure is, that's one. Mexico, when Cortez first got there, there were, excuse me, the circular city in what is now Mexico City. There's just lots of examples of it. And I think those were just the instructions that people were given. Here, this is what you need to build. We see similar construction techniques on both sides of the Atlantic. One of the sites that is often referred to as Atlantis is Bimini. Most people have probably seen pictures of the Bimini Road. And it's actually a J-shaped structure, which is very similar to some of the pier structures in around what was Carthage. So either the traditions traveled with people, or people were given the traditions in multiple places. And, we even do that today. I mean, people, if you look at their houses, there's capes, there's gambrel roof. The houses don't change much, and there's common dimensions about how things are done. So I don't find it that unusual that you would have multiple cities around the world that had a similar structure. It was actually pretty efficient. Everybody gets beachfront property. You have easy commerce, by having a series of rings where boats and stuff could come in. And, canals were much bigger than we think, especially in Central and South America and even North America, although we've done a really good job of destroying most of them. Florida in particular still has lots of evidence of a huge canal network that existed at one time. And I think it was actually pretty prevalent in Louisiana and that area, but just from flooding from the Mississippi and stuff, a lot of them have been filled in swamps and stuff. So it's hard to find all the missing pieces.
Well, I have found of late that a lot of the fables and myths and stories that we played with as we were growing up, and I've always, I read through whole sections of the library when I was in high school because I was so fascinated with it. But all of these stories of of gods and of huge floods and all of it, we are finding today that they weren't stories. If a myth has lasted to this point in time, thousands of years later, it probably happened.
Right.
And so I think we need to revisit a lot of these fables that we've just sort of ticked off as that was something that the people people talked about this to keep their kids from getting in trouble and stuff, because it's not the case. And especially with the big floods and everything, that's easily described by an asteroid or a comet strike, or so many other things, so that we need to really look back at these stories, and Atlantis is one of them.
Sure.
they have Valhalla, they have I'll say it wrong, Hyperborea.
Hyperborea.
And El Dorado.
Or
these
even
are all.
Just look at the Bible. The Book of Eden. Where was the Garden of Eden? Yeah, it's if you look at the translation, one of the problems with the Bible is that it's been translated so many times, and that a lot of times the translations got missed. I've heard that one of the better translations for in the beginning is from that which was, which opens up so many more possibilities. And it talks about, different traditions talk about man being fashioned from mud, So, and I think the flood of Noah actually was about 3,000 or 4,000 years later. And I haven't written too much about that, but recent evidence in Israel has found that a huge deluge took place there, probably about 3,000 years after the Younger Dryas event, which kind of tracks with the Bible as well. If you look at some of the other sources, the Library of Alexandria, for instance, supposedly had over 100,000 years of history prior to Noah. So, we don't know how much history we've lost.
Well, it's such a shame because, that old saying, those who don't know history tend to repeat it, which is unfortunate. Yep. But we seem to be doing that. Well,
one of the interesting things I find is that it used to be that when you said Atlantis to anybody who's in the academic world, they just kind of scoffed at it because it was kind of the kiss of death if you tried to be an academic. And, the days of Clovis were, that was as far back as you could go. But in recent years, they've started digging below that, and what are they finding? They're finding stuff. So, now that, 10,000 years is not the barrier that it was before, I think they will start finding a lot of things that shouldn't be there based on the current history books.
Look at Göbekli Tepe. I mean,
right.
That's one of my favorite things. I spoke with someone on that just the other night, and what gets to me is they've got 20 acres, and they've only uncovered about five of these structures, and
sure.
and it's fascinating. They have analyzed stuff and they've made decisions on stuff, but there are like acres and acres of ruins there yet. You don't know what else is buried there to suddenly, say, I've got it, when it's like, the blind man and the elephant. Depending on where he's touching, he's going to describe it in one way or another. And I'm fascinated with all of it. I'm also fascinated with how mankind, humanity, if you will, is able to have figured out the progression of the equinoxes as rapidly as they have. And
sure.
It seems to me, tens of thousands of years ago they were aware of that, but they hadn't invented the wheel yet. So it doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
Either
the technology, it's gone in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
One of the things I find especially interesting is the fact that the further you go back in time, the blocks get larger. And, you have sites like Baalbek in Lebanon where you have some of the largest blocks ever cut on Earth. And in some cases, we don't even have the equipment to move them today. So, what sort of technology, ropes and wood rollers wouldn't have cut it for a lot of these blocks. The Western Wall in Jerusalem is a good example, not quite as dramatic, but if you ever go there, towards the top, they have, relatively small blocks. And as you get down to the bottom 3 or 4 layers, they get much larger. So over the last couple of years, I've started looking at a lot of Roman sites because that's where it's if you know what you're looking for, you can start to see it. But it really appears like a lot of these Etruscan and pre-Etruscan were simply built on top of. And so what may have been Atlantean or Atlantean era sites suddenly became the foundations for these new buildings. And if you look at them, you see that the construction is completely different. They didn't just make larger blocks for the foundation. They built on something that probably wasn't theirs. And excuse me, this has been a common issue with the Mayans. They had a tradition when a new ruler came in, they would kind of tear things down and rebuild it. So it makes it hard to date things when they're constantly being redone. And so,
or they built
trying
over
to go
the
back,
old ones.
They built over the old ones, and this isn't just true for these types of cultures. Even our more modern cultures. If you look at a lot of the religious sites that Christian churches are built on, they're built on ancient historic sites. We basically stole the significance of the site for our own purposes. So a lot of things I think are hidden in plain sight.
Well, yeah, and I've secrets of the stones. Nobody can explain how people did the corbelled construction when they were trying to plant fields and survive.
Right.
They're too big, and you look at places in Peru, same thing, huge stones. Egypt, huge blocks. How could a culture, and you can't tell me that 20,000 men labored for 20 years to do this. Doesn't make sense.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. So we've missed a point here. and
if you start looking at some of the stones, in particular, you can find evidence of varying technologies. So a lot of stones have evidence of being cut with saws. They're very even cut marks on a lot of these. Some show that they were drilled with pneumatic drills because they've done studies about what the feed rate is for a drill and what you could do with a copper tube versus a high-speed pneumatic. And then you have sites like Pumapunku, where you have these, they're like Legos, they're giant Legos that clearly show signs that they may have been poured rather than cut, which is, you see this same issue in Saskatchewan and in Egypt, where a lot of the blocks have these nubs on them, which is more of a characteristic of having something been poured as opposed to cut. And if you look at there are pictures of the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and if you look at the blocks very carefully, there's an indentation around the outside, which is what would happen if you it's like if you stacked bricks on one another while they were still wet, and they basically sunk into the blocks below them. So there's things like that you are common around if you know what to look for.
Well, and in a lot of places there's no mortar, that they literally are so finely cut that they just, you can't put a dollar bill in between them or a credit card in between them. So you're looking for Atlantis, but you're also looking apparently, and I think appropriately, for the culture that did this, the culture that seeded the consciousness of humanity. And there are rumors, you hear stories of the giants or the wise men or the whatever, and yet nobody ever follows up on it.
Sure.
The Magi, they weren't magicians, they were astrologers or astronomers. Probably both. But we've sort of just glossed over it all in telling our history to our children, and not really gone into, well, who were they? Where did they come from? Where did they? It's kind of like you get to the point where you understand a concept of God, and then you want to know who made God. It's sort of like take it back further. And I keep I hit the wall at the Younger Dryas days and mass extinction. It's almost like humanity supposedly has been on the planet for over 130,000 years, or even longer. So we've been here on the planet for a very long time, and parts of us have survived 5 mass extinctions, and over that period of time, apparently every time one hits or an asteroid hits or something happens, we get taken back to the Stone Age and have to start all over again, building up what culture and civilization is. And it seems to me that there are records or reminders that we've done this before in things like the Great Pyramid and things like some of these out-of-place objects that can't possibly have. I mean, they've got batteries that apparently somebody used, and electricity. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's in some of the carvings in Egypt, there's what appear to be electric lights, and that's still speculation, but they definitely know that a lot of jewelry in particular was electroplated. So they know the technology was used. There's also speculation that they understood nanotechnology, the blue pigment that a lot of drawings in Egypt used has nanotechnology properties to it. And that's probably not coincidence. Corn, for instance, is you won't find corn in the wild. You might find wild wheat, wild rice, but corn has basically been man-made, and it started as a grass, but really after the Younger Dryas event, somebody needed a food source that was reliable, and they suddenly started turning what was just a local grass into something that has become, a staple for most of the world's population.
Again, Younger Dryas,
Yep. I think that's where all of this starts to. Yep. What I think happened as the survivors were scrambling, they were primarily a coastal civilization in all the areas that they occupied, but they suddenly needed to have new food sources. All of their foods were wiped out, and they've done studies on what happened to the woolly mammoth, and they think originally they died out with the Ice Age, but the current convention of thought is that they were actually hunted to extinction, which means you had a lot of people that were hunting mammoth in North America. In South America, there's a professor at UPenn, Clark Erickson, who's been studying the Bimini region of Bolivia for years. And they have raised platforms throughout the Amazon. And you see it on a smaller scale in the Andes with the Inca. But these are essentially mounds that would have had potentially corn, and squash was a huge food then. And then they were all interconnected with waterways. This actually had two different effects. One, it regulated the temperature around the vegetables that they were growing, but it also potentially acted like a giant radiator for the planet as they find this more and more extensive through the Amazon. The Amazon today, is a huge source of the Earth's oxygen. And, they may have needed to do some advanced terraforming. This would, in a large area, it could have actually helped control the temperature of the planet. But the bigger issue is that the amount of gardens, these raised beds that they found just in the Amazon, would have fed a population probably 10 to 15 times what they believed to be in South America at that time. So I think you are dealing with different parts of the globe producing different products on a fairly large scale. They found, go ahead.
No, in Michigan they have ancient flower beds too that are huge. They're way beyond what a simple village would have utilized. And
the other
around,
thing in Michigan is copper mining on a huge scale. And the legendary metal of Atlantis was, I believe it was pronounced orichalcum, and they've never really determined what that was, but they think it was some sort of an alloy of copper and tin. And a group of bars were found a couple of years ago in the Mediterranean. I haven't seen the actual analysis of them, but assuming it was copper and tin or something similar, I've looked at where were certain things mined. You have a lot of mining in Wales and the British Islands. Another unusual thing that we've seen in Mexico and certain other places is use of mercury. and I don't know what that was used for or why they did stuff with it, but there are certain areas with extensive mercury mining. Same with iron throughout Africa and elsewhere. So things on a large scale.
That brings to mind too. I know in one of the pyramids in South America, and
yes,
then in the tomb of the emperor, the first emperor,
yep.
there was liquid mercury in both places, and
correct.
it was used to replicate rivers and stuff like that. First of all, where did they figure out what it was and how to process it? Getting mercury processed so that it is liquid mercury is not an easy process. So
right.
Where did that come from?
And who accidentally found out how to do that, or was that knowledge given to them?
Exactly. Yeah. You make a great case for the fact that there was a culture, or there was I come back to consciousness, because it's kind of like the beds in Michigan. They planted corn, they planted peas, they planted squash, and the three of them together made sure that the beds were, first of all, very productive, and second of all, the corn kept it kind of enclosed so that predators couldn't come in and get at it. And the mines in Michigan have been in now. It's funny. I sometimes, when you say it's been so many years since something happened, and then you realize that so many more years are piled onto that. But Michigan, the mines there had been in production for 9,000 years. That takes you almost back to right after the Younger Dryas days.
Right.
And
I think those dates are only based on what was acceptable to date it at. I think they're actually much older.
Well, it's very much iron and copper are very similar in that they have a DNA sort of their own, so that if you can get a piece of copper and test it, you can tell where it came from, what mine it came from, and the same with iron. And I think they found that a lot of the copper that was from Michigan ended up in Italy and Spain and
right.
and in Europe. So that but this oricorium, that fascinates me, because that goes back to Atlantis, to Plato talking about buildings that were made of this material. And isn't there zinc in it too, or is it?
Yeah, again, they don't know exactly what it was, but probably some combination of copper, tin, and zinc.
Okay.
Again, they've never actually found, although these ingots that they found a couple years ago may fit the bill, but I've seen what the analysis was of how they're made.
But so they have these bricks of this. What was it used for?
I don't know. It was the metal of choice for doing things.
Was it jewelry? Was it I don't know, eating utensils? Was it spears and knives and swords? I mean, I know that the Iron Age came when iron was started to be used, but what makes oricorium and what would you use it for? Nails?
I don't know. I think it was probably just a general purpose metal that was used for artwork and construction. A lot of these large stone structures that you said they don't typically have mortar, but a lot of them do have clips that hold the blocks together. In a lot of the ones in South America, the Spaniards and different people have stole that. They're that they were probably gold or something, but people have stripped them for whatever money they could get them. So a lot of those types clips were used, or they may have just through the elements have rotted away. So I don't know. We don't have any firm evidence of what it actually was. It's a lot of speculation. But based on the fact that copper mining was done on such a large scale, it's pretty safe that that was one of the main ingredients of it. So it could have been used for just about anything.
Because didn't Plato say that there were buildings that they had that were built from it, or that they glowed red in the sunlight or something like that?
Yeah.
Huh.
Which kind of hints at copper.
Yeah. True. So you've got all of this material intelligence. I mean, I can understand why you're into this. I mean, it just you get some facts and they suddenly say, wait, they wave red flags at you, and you certainly have a lot of red flags waving here.
Sure.
How do you know where to look next? I mean, you've got all of these different places that you have certainly targeted as possibilities. We have ground penetrating radar now, so that you're able to go and look and see where is it that they had. I guess it was Spain, that area that flooded. That they looked down and they used
the salt marshes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been one of the areas that above ground is it got a fair amount of attention, but I don't know that they've really done much in the way of excavation. There was some work that was done in the 1970s that the city of Cadiz, actually off the coast, there's actually more ruins supposedly. So again, it fits with the idea that there was something in that area. It just, there's been a lot of stuff found in Spain, whether it's on the East Coast or one of my favorite pieces of artwork came from an area called Alicante, which is in it's southeast of Barcelona. And again, the Lady of Elche, as it's referred to, is the bust of a woman in a costume that doesn't match with anything else in the area. The site is attributed to the Romans, but it may be much older than that. So, and if you look at the statue, it actually resembles Princess Leia a little bit, and it also looks like some of the Mayan headdress artwork that's out there. So there's traditions like that you see in different parts of the world.
Now, you made a very good case for the Berbers being
sure.
Descendants of Atlantis. You want to kind of share that a little bit? That was pretty interesting.
Sure. I mean, they're in the right place. They're in northwestern Africa. They're above Mauritania, which would be if the eye of the reshot structure, or the eye of Africa is. They tend to be Caucasian. They tend to have blue to green eyes, and they have a high number of twins as part of their population, which was one of Plato's characteristics, that he said that there were many twins in the land, and it was actually the ruling groups were groups of twins. There were 12 groups, so I think those actually represented 12 city-states, which tells me that there may have been a central place, which is often referred to as Posidonia, but I think there were probably at least half a dozen of these city-states around the area of the Atlantic on both sides. I think you will, if they start looking, you may find one that would be in Northern Africa and Spain, in the Caribbean, Brazil, the Azores. There's just lots of opportunities for. But once you take the water out of the Atlantic, it gives you a lot more to play with. And I don't think it was. It may have been an island. I don't necessarily think it was. I think it was just coastal areas. One of the things about Africa that most people don't realize is that there used to be a giant lake in the middle of the Sahara and a series of rivers that connected probably the Mediterranean with somewhere in the southern part of Eastern Africa. So it is possible that half of Africa may have just been a large island, depending on how large the body of water was that originally went through the middle of it. But they know there are at least 3 main rivers that no longer exist that would cut north to south from the Mediterranean through Africa and the Sahara. So there's a possibility that was part of it. The other big thing that is common is just the ATL reference that shows up in place names and cultures and stuff. You know, you have the Atlas Mountains where the Berbers live. You know, lots of references to that.
I think that when people start talking about Atlantis, they envision the geography of the planet as it is now, and you bring up a great point that the Fertile Crescent, which is now basically just desert and icky, it was fertile. It was if you go back enough thousands of years, you will find that not only was the terrain much different, but the weather was different, the tilt of the earth was different, and I think it would be a great teaching tool to somehow create what geographically the world looked like 9,500, 11,500, 14,500 years ago. Gives you a better understanding of, among other things, the level of the oceans. And I wanted to go back, you talked about the woolly mammoth, and how do you explain then the woolly mammoth that was fast frozen and had bluebells in its mouth?
Sure. Again, I believe this ties to the Younger Dryas event. If you've ever seen the movie The Day After Tomorrow, you have global warming where things suddenly collapse. And I think, you would have, with the meteors striking the water, there was just millions of gallons of seawater that were vaporized and put into the upper atmosphere, which for a while raised the temperature. But at some point, something happened with the jet stream and you had a sudden collapse. So, temperatures froze, almost overnight in certain areas. And that's how you have those types of examples.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think that when we talk about Atlantis, that if you're talking several hundred feet, more of coastline, then you don't know. And the fact that just look today, civilization is really clustered around the water's edge, so to speak. So if you add another 400 or 500 feet to it, it would stand to reason that advanced civilization is probably hidden there. And like on your website or somewhere, you said hidden in plain sight. I think that you have to consider that. I mean, even looking at that underwater structure that they found off of the coast of Japan.
Sure, Yonaguni.
it looks man-made, although they're saying it's not, but it still feels like it's man-made.
Yeah, I think it is man-made. I think the problem people have with it is that it doesn't seem to be anything specific. It's just a series of very straight, angular things. But we see some of that in South America too. You see blocks that seem to be cut for no reason, or steps that are 20 feet high. Again, why would somebody do that? It doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm sure there was a good reason for it. You don't have to go that deep either. I mean, we know that parts of the Atlantic were up to 400 feet lower than they are today. But even in the Mediterranean, there are at least 200 cities that are documented underwater in the Mediterranean. There's a few that Alexandria, there's a couple of Egyptian cities that have been pretty popular in the last few years, but most of them, it's, the locals know about them. There's not much to see. You've got a lot of silt. They're expensive to excavate, and, they've been documented by somebody, and they just leave them alone. But, when you figure there's just in the Mediterranean that there were that many cities, just imagine what there were elsewhere in the world. In India, for instance, you've got two major cities that were part of legends for years that, in the last 10 to 20 years, they've actually found evidence of. And they date from this same time period.
Huh. Is there anything? I know that there have been some theories about being able to trace Atlantean survivors' DNA, whether it's the Rh negative or whether it's a certain blood type or whatever. Is there any way of linking some of these cultures together with DNA to sort of trace where if there were Atlanteans, and I do believe there were, where they came from or where they went to?
Yeah, that's. I think eventually that may be the case. Up until I think 2 years ago, they basically thought everybody on the planet could be traced back to a couple of people, and then there was a gentleman in South Carolina who showed a DNA pattern that pushed back the timeline of man that they knew about by 50,000 years. So, if you figure that it was a coastal civilization and most people were wiped out and the remainders just moved inland, and then in the last 10,000 years, I think there's been a lot more commerce between the different parts of the world than the history books provide credit for. It's hard to know exactly how much diffusion of DNA has taken place. I think it's more than what people would think it is. If you look around the area around Stonehenge, for instance, the DNA profile there shows that a group moved into the area, I think about 5,000 years ago, that seemed to come from Turkey. And, that doesn't match with any of the history of what we know from the area, but that's what the DNA tells us. I think you would find similar patterns of DNA the further you go back.
And don't the Cherokee, isn't there something with their DNA as well?
Yes, they have Middle Eastern elements to their DNA. The more you look into this, the more cross-pollination you see between different cultures. The speculation is that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it does make you wonder. You tend to think of all these places as isolated clusters, and yet it seems that there was certainly a little bit of connection because the DNA seems to be kind of blurred. I mean, you don't have anything that is so isolated that they haven't spread themselves out a little bit from time to time, so that
right.
So there had to be more communication than we know of.
Yeah, and even just in the more modern times of Greece and Rome, there are fairly well documented, although they haven't actually found any of these, talking about these long boats that were hundreds of feet long that had that had a few hundred people rowing. They've never found anything quite that large, although there was one of the Roman emperor's pleasure boats that was, and this was quite large. They built a facility for it it was near Lake Garda, I think, in Italy. It was destroyed during World War II. But this thing had, it was huge and multiple levels, and that was apparently not that uncommon back then. So I think, the sea people, as are referred to in several cases, I think people got around quite well between cultures. And I think, just the patterns of currents in the Atlantic made for relatively easy trade if you had the manpower to move things around.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so you've been looking for Atlantis for 40 years.
Yes.
And or more.
I've worked and have a family in between there too, so it's not something I do all the time.
Yeah, I gotcha. But in your search, it seems that you've found that Atlantis truly is in so many different places. How do you explain that? I mean, are you looking for a seed, a place where it originated, or are you looking for people? Are you looking for a place, or are you looking for a people, I guess is the better way to put it.
I think originally I was looking for a place, and over time I think more looking for a people, and just trying to define, who they were and, what are the elements of Atlantean society, and try to work our way back to, where are the missing pieces. There's a lot of potential clues in the Edgar Cayce readings, and he takes a kind of a different spin on the whole thing, talking about, higher technologies and the Hall of Records and that type of stuff. So again, that it changes it up a little more than just a historical site reference from Plato. But I think if you know where the places are, you can start to. I think things were organized into specific patterns. Some of the sites are currently above ground. A lot of them, I believe, are underground, typically somewhere between 12 and 20 feet in North America and elsewhere. In Göbekli Tepe, for instance, that was intentionally buried, but I think it would have been buried anyways through natural processes based on what we've seen. So, some of the prominent sites were simply built upon top of, but a lot of it that might not have been rebuilt was simply covered over with, dozen feet of dirt or so. So it makes it challenging because I think there were a lot of these traditions that were just passed on after the fact, and I think some of them got lost. If you looking at something as simple as the Grimm's fairy tales, the fairy tales we tell our kids now are not the way that the Grimm's brothers wrote them down initially.
No,
and
they
I
were
think
grim.
A lot of they were very violent. They were designed to scare children. But
yeah,
yeah, I think a lot of these techniques and people building pyramids and things like that, those continue to be passed on. But I think a lot of the later generations really didn't know why they were doing stuff. It's like, well, this is our tradition. This is why we do stuff. And as I made my maps, what I found was that there were so many sites. A lot of the newer ones didn't seem to match like they should. They were just kind of random. And I think things kind of got polluted. If you look at the Nazca lines, for instance, there's lines that overwrite other lines. And I think the same thing took place there. There was an original group of lines that were there for a reason, and then as the locals knew about them, and over time it's like, well, we need to make more of these, and they just started adding to them, and pretty soon you've got this, just kind of a collage that doesn't really have its original meaning. And that's where what I've been doing lately with the maps is trying to look back at specific sites that have blocks of a certain size, because that seems to be kind of the starting point. Once you start getting blocks under a couple of tons, those could be done by anybody. But the blocks where they were 2 to 100 tons, those I think are probably of this original civilization, whether it's Atlantis or whatever the original name was.
Yeah, it does seem as though, I mean, the only way you can explain it is, I sometimes have thought, especially looking at Egypt, that a lot of those huge statues were actually life-size. So maybe it was giants that did a lot of this stacking of things.
There's a lot of legends to that effect.
Really? I know that there were giants in those days.
Not with Egypt specifically, but there's a sword in Japan that is it's roughly 12 feet long and weighs 35 pounds. And unless somebody had wanted it as a very cool ornament, if that was actually used by somebody, they had to have been 15 to 20 feet tall. And there's lots of legends about these giants all over the world, but so far no real evidence of it. Supposedly there was quite a bit of evidence that the Smithsonian had during the 1920s, and they took it out into the Atlantic and dumped it off a boat.
Yep, off a barge.
Yep. So we'll never know.
No, and it's sort of like the things that we take for granted in another 100 years. I mean, have you seen? There's a video on YouTube someplace where they gave a whole bunch of teenagers a dial telephone and they couldn't make it work.
Sure.
They didn't know how to dial. So that we may be trying to figure out something that was just so second nature to a group of people thousands of years ago that it never occurred to them that somebody wouldn't understand what it was they were doing.
Right.
But does. I do believe that from everything that I've read and all the people I've talked to, I think there was a culture, a civilization, and I at this point in time, I do believe it came from, as I said before, it came from before the last extinction, so that they were survivors, and they may well have been scattered all over the world when something hit, so that they were in areas where they had to make do, and they became probably leaders or people in charge because they had they had a greater know-how and were able to pass on that know-how, but once several generations passed, that know-how kind of got lost.
Right.
And
I think you can see that just even today with our technology. Take a tractor, for instance. If you bought a tractor, one of the things that's been happening lately with a lot of farmers is that there's a lot of demand for tractors that were built before 1980 because they're relatively simple to maintain and you can fix them yourself. Tractors that are made today are all computerized, and when the computer goes, you're stuck. You've got to get a authorized repair person to come in and fix things. So I could see something like that happen. The other thing that people, once you start talking about potentially advanced technology, and they want to say, well, where are the machines? Where's the evidence? Well, all you have to do is kind of look at our own technology for the last 50 years. And, we reached a point where we had giant machines and stuff. And now we're starting to become environmentally conscious. And, the technologies that we're coming up with actually are designed to go away. They're designed to work with nature. So, we're making plastic bags that self-decompose. I think that the Atlantis people reached a point where their technology would disappear in a very short period of time globally, a few hundred years, just because they tried to be environmentally conscious. There's a lot of evidence that I've seen that from an artistic perspective and stuff, they like to do things playing with light and sound, and may have had a different concept of art than what we think of today. There's evidence of terraforming on a large scale in a lot of areas, and not just things that are a couple of 100 feet across, things that may only show up from space that are miles across. So somebody was thinking about art and how things were organized on a much larger scale. I mean, the Nazca lines is one of the more obvious things. It was designed to be seen from, above the earth, which, we're still debating on how they did that. But they can't be seen from ground level. And there are many of these types of geoglyphs and patterns around the world. One of the amazing things that I like about Machu Picchu is not the construction itself, but there is an entire mountain range that is off in the distance. That's the face. And this face shows up all over North America and South America in different ways. And it's the profile of a man who probably had a beard. But somebody spent a lot of time modifying nature to meet their artistic needs.
Well, in South Africa, Dean Lepini has a book on, and they have faces all over.
Sure.
That are astounding, and they're huge, and yet, they're there in the mountains, and you don't actually notice them unless somebody points them out.
And sometimes you can only see them at certain times of the day or certain times of the year. You're right. At Chichen Itza is a good example of the serpent that goes down the side of the pyramid on the solstice. That took a little bit of planning. You also have the ball court there, which is designed acoustically. So you can, you clap in one part of the ball court, and the sound echoes. There's a certain number of times that it echoes, and it has a certain meaning. I forget what the exact number is. but that doesn't happen by chance.
No, there are architects that are brilliant, but when you look at the world population at these particular times, I mean, it was not extreme. I keep going back to the Coral Castle down in Florida too. Now, how that was built, they haven't. I think it's amazing. You know, this happened just in the last couple hundred years. How could they not be able to figure out how that man did that?
Yeah, he left some clues. His name was Edward Leeds Scanlon, and he wrote a book about it. He was a very eccentric character. The closest anyone saw to him moving one of the blocks was he had to hire a truck. He had to move the whole thing. He built it, and then I don't remember the exact details, but he had to move it from its original site to where it is now. And he had to hire a truck driver to move the blocks. And he basically made the guy go take a walk while he moved each one. And he never actually got to see him do it, but from his just the things that he left behind, it did seem to involve something with either electricity or magnetism. But I don't know beyond that. They've never actually figured it out. He said you can figure out what he did from his books, but I've looked at them and they're not that revealing. But he said he did basically the same thing that the Egyptians did.
Dang.
And there's lots of, if you look at Easter Island, for instance, the legend says that the blocks they march themselves into their own position. So, and that there's been a lot of the stories about blocks being floated to different locations. So I'm sure there was something going on there.
They talk about Merlin, helping to build Stonehenge by, moving the blocks by levitation. So, and the more you talk about all of these stories that have come through time, if they've managed to come through time, there has to be a meaning to them. I don't think there's any story, fable, legend, whatever, that we still are repeating that doesn't have the element of truth in them, so that it's sort of like, you're right, it's hidden in plain sight, and you kind of wonder if you could get somebody from that time frame, and bring them forward in time. They look at you like, well, you don't know how to do that,
Right.
But with a lot of our technology today, they have built-in obsolescence, so that they are intentionally building things that won't last, so that you have to go out and buy more. But it boggles my mind that with the brains that we've got, the brain banks that we've got, that we haven't been able to figure out some of this stuff over the generations that have been looking at them and trying to figure them out.
Well, I think we're just getting to the point where we're starting to have some of the same technologies that were present back then. There's a couple of artists, and I can't think of their names, but they do stuff with stone, and they basically are able to mold it into pretty much any shape that they want. And there's stories from South America about certain plants being used to essentially dissolve stone. And that fits with a lot of what seems to have been done at a lot of the Inca sites, for instance. But there's also evidence of blocks being cut as well. And even in Egypt, the outside of the pyramid are referred to. There's an area referred to as the boat pits. I don't know, but they actually, based on Chris Dunn's work, he estimates that those were actually the mounting spaces for saw that was roughly, I think it was like 27 feet across. which would account for, because he looked at the where the tool marks are on some of the blocks that they found that were cut. They indicate a saw that was massive. So I think there was a combination of techniques that were used to, the pyramid itself isn't all neatly cut blocks. There's actually a lot of fill in between. There's the interior blocks, which are very precise, and then in between there are some. I think there were some foundational stones, and then a lot of fill stones that were kind of poured in between, and then you had the casing stones, of which most of them are gone. I think they were stripped off thousands of years ago to make local buildings and stuff. But a variety of techniques, and I think we're just, we're starting to be able to do some of the same things that I think were done back then.
So the people actually that we'll call them the Atlanteans that were so advanced, it would seem to me that where they came from possibly is not there anymore, but it just feels to me as though there has to be some way of, see, again I come to consciousness, how they were able to perceive all of this and take it, from, it feels like that they were able to come into a culture that was not advanced and shoot them ahead 1,000 years or so as far as, being able to work with things. And the only explanation that there is for how that jump in technology with the pyramids, with Pumapunka, with the Mayan, with so many of them, there just is such a leap in workmanship, if you will.
Right. It wasn't sustained though. It seemed to have served a purpose, and then it was forgotten about. So I think you had a variety of these advanced structures that were built, and then in many cases, if you look at some of the stones in Baalbek, they didn't even finish cutting them; they just left them. So something stopped the process. The stones at Pumapunku look like children's toys that are scattered around. It's all broken up, and clearly there were earthquakes in the region. But any traditions that might have existed for how they were constructed seems to have gone away rather as quickly as it showed up. So you have these giant buildings.
Could it have been generational? It lasted for a couple of generations, and then
probably. I think
even if that.
Once we start digging.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say once you start going back further than the Younger Dryas event, I think you'll start finding some interesting things. But again, so much has been built on top of and destroyed in the process. I'm not sure how much is still there. I know during the 20s, and I used to live in West Texas, and you've heard of the Rockwall, the town of Rockwall there. There's a fairly large structure underground, but I had wanted to see that at one point, but I had heard of some roads that are essentially made of glass or glass-like blocks, and they've been found in Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and in Texas. And I thought I forget where the area was. It was near San Angelo, which is not near Rockwall. But during the 50s, there was a stream that washed out and exposed one of these roads. And apparently a lot of the locals just gathered them up and used them they were nice paving stones. So there's a lot of people in West Texas that have, pavers in their yard that may have been part of, Atlantean roads. Some of the ones that were better built, there's stories of people trying to build cellars and different foundations in the 20s and 30s, and they would hit one of these layers and they just give up and have to go somewhere else because it was too hard to cut through. So I think once people get comfortable, or academics get comfortable dealing with some of the sites they're seeing that are 10,000 plus years, they may start finding other things and then start digging back to, 20, 30,000 and seeing what's still out there.
Well, you look at the Bosnian Pyramids that are supposedly over 40,000 years old. And the ceramic stones, are you familiar with them at all? The ceramic stones that are in there that help to keep them from being flooded?
Not specific. They're part of the Bosnian Pyramid?
Yeah, in the tunnels. Yeah. In the tunnels there are these ceramic stones, and they're ceramic. And apparently they moved one of them, and the tunnel immediately flooded, so they now leave them alone because it helps to keep them dry. And and again, another, how did you do it? Who did you? Darren Kuyu.
Yes, I was just going to say, you had when you said these ceramic stones, Darren Kuyu has these giant discs that closed off the different tunnel systems. And they estimate that those had populations of, up to 10,000 people living in them at one point. Why would you have 10,000 people living underground anywhere? We don't do that today.
With their animals.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So,
I'm sure they had a very good reason.
You'd have to really be convincing to get me to go below ground like that. And clearly, they had sources of water and air, but they weren't growing crops there for sure. So,
well, and I think you can kind of take some clues from Göbekli Tepe because that was intentionally buried. What I think happened with the Younger Dreier event, I don't think it was a surprise. I think they knew it was going to happen. They couldn't prevent it, obviously. But to the extent possible, they tried, people who were able to, left the areas and moved underground. But
the Younger Dreier days went on for several thousand years. There
were a couple of different events.
Yeah, it's not like, we have to, shelter in place for six months. You're talking generations. Right. So how can it blows my mind that
I think the Hopi have a
survived.
tradition have seven ages of man, and how in Mexico the ant people, talking about them living underground. The concept of living underground at some point around the time that the Garden of Eden and stuff took place is one of those global concepts. So if they knew this was happening, or maybe they, after it happened, that was the only place that they knew it was safe, because it's possible that the asteroids may have, it didn't just happen one day and destroyed everything. This probably went on for quite some time.
Yeah, and I can see how, if that was the case, if you were underground for years, generations, that once you finally made it back into the light, you no longer, could grow crops. You no longer, whatever animals had survived, had to be hunted, and they weren't domesticated anymore. And in there's a cave in France and Chauvet and Cave of Dreams, and you're talking artwork and stuff that goes back thousands and
40,000
thousands of years. Yeah.
Yep.
And they're it's fascinating. They don't let people in except for very short periods of time, and they have to stay on the little pathways, not pathways, but the little ramps that they have laid out there.
I don't think they let anybody in anymore. They created a laser model of it that you can go in, but unless you're an academic, I don't think they let people in at all anymore.
Oh, tourists can't go in for sure.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that in the floor are the footsteps of a young child and a wolf or a panther. I forget what it was, right next to one another, so that either they were different time frames, or the wolf or the panther, whatever it was, had been domesticated to a degree. And you think about antiquity of that age, and most people are thinking Homer and Barney, and or ape type people, dragging their knuckles on the floor. And when you see the paintings that are on those walls, there's a documentary on YouTube. It's called Cave of Dreams, and it's amazing. The artwork is just so alive.
It's a map.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just it does boggle your minds when you think that we tend to think of primitive people as primitive minds, and that's not the case.
Right.
So that they may not have had the technology, but they still had the talent, and they had the artistic talent. I mean, they created jewelry. They created flutes. They had music. They had I think they found some flutes that were out of a wing of a bird or something. I know that they had music. And so, again, going back, I would love to see a map of some sort showing what the geography was like 40,000 years ago in these places.
Sure.
Because
there's actually quite a few examples of that. What I find interesting is that even though we know what the coastlines were 10, 20,000 years ago, people really don't think, okay, well, where did people live at that time? And, based on historical patterns of where people live, they probably lived in those areas that are now underwater.
Wow. Well, probably.
All you have to do is look at the population of the United States and where people live. Roughly 80% of the population is within 500 feet of sea level, and that's been true throughout history.
You have things like the Atlantic Trench. Now that still had to be water, I would think.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's awfully deep.
Sure.
But our oceans weren't quite so big, and I mean, you could walk from France to England, and you don't think of that. You think of the globe as it is today, and you just wonder how could that possibly have happened. But the geography was so different, and you're right. Everybody clusters around the shoreline. I wonder why that is.
And even elevations were different too. Bolivia and Peru area were much lower in sea level than they are today. But the planet's always moving, so that makes it hard as well. Especially with my maps, the further you go back in time, things have shifted. So if it was designed off of fairly precise coordinates, the distance between London and New York today is not what it would have been 20,000 years ago. The Atlantic is expanding, the Pacific is contracting. So we have a constantly moving planet.
We still haven't, obviously there was a culture that was highly evolved, that was scattered across the globe and sort of blended in and became indigenous with whatever culture was there at the time and enhanced them greatly. But you kind of want to know, where did they come from?
Right. And where did they go? They seem to have been around for a short period of time, and then we went kind of through some sort of a dark age, where the old knowledge was wiped out. And we've done this to ourselves. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, probably, a lot of questions could have been answered there. But
oh my gosh,
it was burned, and look at all the scrolls from the Mayans that the Spanish destroyed because it was blasphemy. There's only 3 scrolls of an entire culture that survived.
And that's because we were too primitive to understand it.
Right.
I mean, if it's not Christian, it doesn't count.
Right.
I mean, when you think of, I often say that the Europeans invaded North America. They didn't come to civilize. They came to invade, and what they didn't understand, they wiped out. So,
right.
It's a little sad and very embarrassing what we have done to those who were indigenous here. But they weren't the people that were living here were not the first people either. And I think that's what is so upsetting, confusing, and befuddling, because we're just dealing with what's on the surface. We don't know what's beneath the surface, and there are tunnels that are in the earth that we don't know where they came from or who made them.
Yeah.
And
whole cave systems that they just found a giant cavern system under Montreal. It's huge. There's cave networks and underground systems that are all over the globe, and most of them show signs of being occupied by humans at some point in the past.
Well, even when we had, the Ice Age, it didn't cover the entire planet, so that there were areas on the planet that South America seems to have gotten off pretty easily, and Australia as well. And,
yep, and
I mean,
I think those became huge sources of food production. Between agriculture in the Amazon basin and in Peru, a lot of commercial fishing. There's evidence that they shipped fish inland and elsewhere, and you had areas that made a lot of textiles as well. A lot of exporting of things around the globe.
Well, it does speak to the perseverance of humanity, in that they and of course these things didn't happen. Well, the Younger Dryas Day did kind of happen overnight, but for the most part, ice ages and things like that didn't come on, overnight. It was a period of time that it evolved, but. When you think about it, I think I read someplace that the Younger Dryas had its impact was greatest with North America, or that North America got, the brunt of it, so to speak. So that would explain why weren't as populated as other places on the planet were.
Yep.
But I kind of go back. Go ahead.
I believe there were two main events based on. There's what they call meltwater pulse. I think A and B were two aspects where they saw significant differences. So of melting of the ice caps.
Sheet ice.
And
yeah.
I think there were multiple instances where we were hit with asteroids.
Well, there's one for sure right off the Yucatan Peninsula, but they.
Yeah, that
I
one
don't
I think
know
is much older. Yep.
So
I don't think that's a recent one.
Well, no, not without memory,
Yeah.
not with a living memory for sure. But you take a look at the moon and you see all of the craters and everything that are on the moon, and you wonder why the Earth doesn't have as many. But then there's so much ocean here that probably a lot of them have hit the ocean, and
right.
So we don't really have any idea as to what's under there. But in a way, it's kind of. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's an area of northern Mexico just south of the U.S. border that actually tends to get more asteroid strikes than anywhere else. And supposedly you can go there and just pretty much watch them fall out of the sky or pick up small meteorites all over the place. So
wow.
There are certain areas that are likely to get hit. I mean, obviously it doesn't hit with big stuff, but lots of little meteorites in large quantities. And there's the theory, too, that the moon has kind of acted as a deflector or a shield for a lot of these because there's lots of objects in our solar system rolling around.
Well, the Bible talks about, fire falling from the sky and stuff like that, and that's, I would clearly think those were meteor strikes.
Well, Sodom and Gomorrah in particular, there are, if you travel around the area where it supposedly existed, you can find little, they're balls of sulfur that would be tied to a potential meteor strike.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's parts of sand that have become glass. It's almost like it was a nuclear explosion, but an asteroid, big enough could certainly have, wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you take another look at, what could this have been? That it was recorded for so many hundreds, maybe thousands of years that it had to be something that really did happen, and then of course it became myth and fable, and then people tend to ignore it. But I would say, I can't think of anything lately that is of that significance that we would be trying to preserve knowledge of it in stone, so to speak, at this point.
Well,
anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, today we've got various seed banks around the world, and NASA's always on the lookout for what they refer to as near-Earth objects. So, we historically, I think the Earth gets hit by a relatively large object about every 100 or so years. The last main one was the Tunguska event that took place in Russia, assuming that was a meteorite. But that tends to be, we're overdue at this point. I figured with 2020 that was one of the last things on the bingo card that we didn't have happen in 2020. But I'm hoping we dodged the bullet there.
Yeah, we haven't really had any big things coming from space, but I would say that as far as our environment goes, we've got earthquakes and floods and stuff like that enough so that we have disaster without it coming from outside of the planet.
Sure.
And our climate is changing, but I think it's a change that I think there is a cycle of climate change that's going on, and the only thing is it's a cycle that is thousands of years old, so that we're trying to blame cows for it, and I don't think that's cause. I mean, I think we do pollute. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it just it's a matter of trying to put blame on something, and cars and stuff like that. This planet, has survived millions and millions of years, and probably in some of the past times between mass destructions, there have been civilizations that have abused the planet as much as we have.
Right.
And
there's been some research of the upper atmosphere, which seems to indicate that there was an industrial civilization at some point in the remote past. So, and I do agree that the cycles of climate change are geologic, but at the same time, I think we've accelerated the cycle for our purposes. Something that might not have happened naturally for another 500 to 1,000 years. I think we've definitely accelerated it through our own purposes. But the good news, I think, is that the more advanced we become, the more likely we are to become energy efficient, and eliminate our carbon footprint and potentially reduce the overall impact that we have on the planet.
Well, maybe they'll let us use the Tesla energy finally.
Yeah. I mean, you're starting to see it in small...
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I have a wireless charger for my phone on my desk. You're starting to see those much more. And that's basic Tesla technology that I think you'll start seeing that on a larger scale, where you don't have to be, touching the object. You'll be able to, charge your, whatever from a distance.
Well, that would be cool. But, getting back to advanced technology and coming into a primitive time, I would hope that they were so far advanced that they realized that they weren't going to be able to share everything. And I would like to think that they left records someplace for your benefit, if nothing else.
Sure. If you follow the Casey readings, he indicates that there are actually three halls of records. One in Egypt, one in the Bimini area, and a third that is probably at a Mayan site called Piedras Negras. So we'll see what happens there.
It would, there was a Twilight Zone episode a long time ago about a man who loved to read and had a wife who nagged him, and he somehow survived a nuclear holocaust and found himself at the library with finally time to read everything, and then he dropped his glasses and stepped on them.
Yes.
And I have a feeling that something similar may happen with our generation, that we will stumble upon these records and not recognize them and make a patio out of them or something. It seems to me that records have been left, and like you said, hidden in plain sight, and that if we could only take the time to decipher them before we destroyed them.
Right.
I do believe that there is knowledge preserved, and we just haven't found it. And But once we find it, are we going to be able to interpret it?
Or know how to access it. You've probably heard of the crystal skulls,
Sure.
and the Mitchell Hedges skull. That's thought to be possible, storage medium of sorts, because people have claimed to be able to see things inside of it. And, theoretically, storing information holographically or electrically within some sort of a quartz structure is kind of what we do now with modern semiconductors. The other possibility is that, depending on how advanced we're talking about, the safest way to store anything would actually be in DNA. And, assuming they were at that level, we have a fair amount of junk DNA in ourselves. I have this crazy theory, which will be interesting if it ever proves true, that cats may actually be the source of DNA storage, because cats have the highest amount of junk DNA of any species. And it's like, why do they have all this extra DNA? But culturally, cats have always been companions and stuff. So if they ever had that capability, that would be a good place to store it, because cats are they're domesticated. We don't eat them, and they're likely to be part of our culture for eons. The likelihood that the Hall of Records or whatever is stored in paper or papyrus or
I don't believe that.
Skin based. It's too likely to be destroyed. And if they had some sort of an advanced culture, I think they would have had some sort of an advanced storage mechanism as well, whether it was holographic or DNA. Those would be the likely two, assuming they had the technology.
Well, for your sake and mine, I hope we figure it out, because, I'd hate to have this dilemma follow me into my next incarnation. I just saw the time.
Sure.
This
I know, we get talking and
fast.
just keep going. Yes.
Yeah. But I want to thank you so much. People, you should go look at the AtlantisProject.org. He's got great information there. And if
and
anybody
I'd love to
out
hear
there
from
has,
people too.
Okay.
I always like to hear new theories and compare notes with different people, because I found that no one person has all the answers, and I think our best chance of solving the mystery is to collaborate.
Oh, I would agree with you totally, and I plan on keeping in touch and checking in with you more frequently than once every decade.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your stuff with us. You have answered a lot of questions and created a lot more. So people should check your website out. And I want to thank you again. This has been such a pleasure, and I will keep in touch with you.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
Take care now, and good night.
All right. Thanks, Barb.
Okay, everybody, thanks for visiting us. Do check out the YouTube channel. If you like what you see, please subscribe to it. That's the way we figure out people are actually listening. So until next time, have a wonderful evening, and we will be back at you next week. Good night now.